Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Wilfred Reilly. Hello, Wilfred. How are you doing?
Doing quite well. What about you?
I'm great, Wilfred. Wilfred, do you know why you are on the show?
Well, I mean, you asked me to come on the show and talk about a couple of different topics that I've written about in the past. I assume that would be the answer. Why do you think I'm on the show?
Well, that's one of the reasons why you're on the show, Wilfred. Another reason why you're on the show is that I like your critique of hereditarian. It is not emotional.
Oh, thank you. Good to
Yeah,
hear.
that's one reason why you're on the show. It shows that you're a serious researcher and you really understand the quantitative method. And I respect serious researchers. That's why you're on the show.
Okay.
All
Well,
right.
good,
So,
good to be here.
Wilfred, we're going to start our conversation by talking about systemic racism. What is systemic racism?
Systemic racism is a vague and undefinable idea that's used as an excuse for a bunch of social issues, would be my kind of glib cocktail party response to that. The idea of systemic racism essentially is that there is a vague, hard to define set of prejudices within society or set of prejudiced institutions within society. I've seen both claims that is responsible for performance differences between ethnic groups. I think that's a fair description. So in a recent piece for City Journal, which is a public intellectual publication, not an academic journal, but a solid one, I broke this down into three segments. The first part of the idea of SR or systemic racism is the idea that society is actually structured to discriminate against minority groups. So this goes back to a thinker, a philosopher named Richard Delgado, whose famous line is racism is everywhere, it's everyday, it's constant. So facially neutral systems, like the SAT exam, for example, or the criminal justice process, are in fact designed to discriminate against, say, Blacks. Part two of most coherent ideas of systemic racism is that you can tell that this discrimination exists because there are gaps in performance between groups and society. So, for example, the scholar Ibram Kendi argues that whenever you see a gap in terms of, for example, SAT performance, you know that you're seeing racism because the only possible explanations for that gap are racism and genetic inferiority. He says deep-seated inferiority. My perception is that he means genetic. Anything else wouldn't make a lot of sense. And the third component of the systemic racism idea generally is that the solution to this is what's called equity, which means absolutely proportional outcomes across all groups, really regardless of performance. So people like Dr. Kendi have called for a federal Department of Anti-Racism, which would intervene in any situation where you see a gap in performance between groups to demonstrate that this is in fact due to racism, which would be the general starting assumption. So the idea of systemic racism is that something in the system, the two usual causal mechanisms that are given are biased laws or latent prejudices, causes all performance differences that we see between large groups today. So that's the core idea there, I think.
All right. What an academic explanation, Wilfred. You're serious, man, and we're going to have a lot of fun in this interview. Wilfred, artificial intelligence, neither of us are experts in this arena, but AI is trained to recognize pattern. And frequently it is being said that AI is racist. Have you been following these arguments? AI is trained
Uh,
to recognize patterns.
Well, I think that this is something that I'm not an expert in this field. It's not the primary thing that I research. So I've probably seen the same thing that many of your followers. Do you mind if I get up and get a water, actually?
Not a problem, not a problem.
Adora, grab some.
Yeah. You can buy his book, Eight Crime Oaks. So in case you're wondering, guess well, he's back now.
Right. So I think that in terms of the AI controversies, what I've seen is probably what anyone who reads, either the New York Times or the Washington Times has, which is the claim that these artificial pattern recognition programs are recognizing the wrong patterns. So we'll talk through some of these together, but the most widely covered I've seen is the claim that AI is transphobic. So when individuals who identify as generally transgender women are recognized by the PRAI, they're recognized as males based on things like the presence of what's colloquially called an Adam's apple, high cheekbones, battered faces, that kind of thing. But this has really gone beyond that simple point. So one argument, for example, has recently been that AI programs are racist. Because if you look at crime prediction software, crime is predicted most often in urban, working class, it was more than 70% minority neighborhoods. And the argument is that there's no way to know this, so we must be seeing racism at work. Again, there's a very simple alternate explanation here.
Exactly. And then there's also another problem with Facebook. Apparently, Facebook created data to minimize racist attacks online, but instead of proving that the victims are mostly Black, the victims are actually mostly whites. But Wilfred, I'm not surprised. As a Black man, Ibram Kendi can accuse a judge of colonizing children because she adopted non-white children. Black people do get away with some rather snide and impertinent remarks.
If I can ask, we're both of Black descent. Is that correct?
Okay, yes, yeah. We're both Black.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's important, based POC conversation. I think it's important to address some of this, honestly and frankly. Much of the research that's done on racism in social science is very bad.
Yes, I interviewed Lee Jussim on implicit bias. Yeah, it is bad.
Yeah, that's one example. There are many examples of this. The one that I'm most familiar with and feel I can talk about from a position of in-field expertise would be the racial resentment scales. So, and I'll get back to your question within literally minutes, if not seconds, but in the 1960s and 70s, we found that both Blacks and whites in the USA were no longer testing as bigots. So if you were to ask someone post-Vietnam War, would you mind working for or serving under a Black person, a white person, a Hispanic? The percentage of people saying they would object had dropped below 20%. We, by most thresholds, we're no longer a racist country. And this is very troubling for a certain kind of person. So you saw the development of these scales that purported to measure racial resentment, a sort of subsurface anger with Blacks, if you will. And what these scales do essentially is just measure the different elements of being conservative. So one question would be, do you object to affirmative action because you view this as unfair, no matter what the historical circumstances? Another question would be, for example, do you think Blacks have had a tough time in this country, but they can damn well make it out just like Irishmen, Italians, Native Americans, other groups have before? And if you answer one of these questions, yes, you would be classified as the next thing to a racist. So for years, we've seen this argument that racial resentment tracks with conservatism, but that's simply because it's a measure of conservatism. And there are many examples of this. The scales used to measure authoritarianism, one hallway down in psychology, were full of questions like, do you object to communism? Or would you be frightened by communists speaking publicly? Would you attempt to shut this down? And so for a long time, authoritarianism was associated with both white and minority conservatives. A couple of years ago, a researcher in Emory down in Atlanta retailored the scale to ask questions about problems with traditionalists or problems with racists. And it immediately became apparent what anyone who's seen a Black Bloc event would have already known, that there were just as many authoritarians on the left. In fact, I believe there were 5 or 6 or 7% more. So this sort of thing is constant, and it's due to, in my opinion, the level of latent prejudice in academia. But yeah, the study that you're referring to, there've been a couple. The general format of this type of research is that you'll make a contact at one of the tech companies, and you will find out which states have the most uses of, for example, the term nigger, frankly, or nigga in text exchanges or Google searches, or which states involve the most searches for racist jokes. And you'll then make up a list of, say, the most racist states based on that search set. The only problem is that there's no way to tell whether the searcher is Black or white. I've brought this up at conferences and events and been sort of hooted down, like what sort of Black people would search for Black jokes? But
A lot of them.
yes, many of them. Anyone that's planning on roasting their friends at a barbecue that day. Yeah, absolutely. So the assumption of this research is that we have found the racists when we found the people searching for, say, my nigga, if you will. But the reality is that most people searching for that term are going to be either Black or they're going to be city kids of whatever color looking for a favorite song. And so this falls into that category of we all know it, but you're not supposed to say it. And that a great deal of the social science around this is badly weakened by ignoring that point.
Exactly. And then IA teaches, what exactly are these studies measuring? We assume that tall people are competent. We prefer tall leaders according to some studies. We conflate weight with incompetence, and aggressive looking people are punished more severely than others. So implicit association tests, what exactly are they measuring?
Well,
Bias is normal. We're all biased.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that they're measuring anything, first of all. So again, I recently wrote a research piece looking at some of the weaknesses in the audit studies genre, and I'm sure people could attack, the methodological arguments I made. So nothing is perfect, but I do think that you see a difference when it comes to the reaction of mainstream media, and for that matter, when it comes to the acceptance patterns at journals, between the treatment of things that purport to find some new innovative form of racism and the treatment of research that kind of pokes holes in that and says, well, a great deal of this just isn't true. So the IAT, the implicit assumptions test, is actually a pretty well-designed, interesting, product of the lab. But I think that the reaction people have had to it is wildly out of proportion to what it determines and what the developers were pretty open about it determining. You can check all this out at Harvard's Project Implicit website, by the way. But the implicit assumptions test is basically, it's generally a series of flickering pictures and then, for example, words. So you would see a facial image and you would be asked to associate that with a positive or negative term or feeling. And the idea is that if you take longer to associate, and this is just one of the earlier, simpler tests, but if you take longer to associate Blackness with goodness or something, that might mean you are implicitly a racist. And please correct if I made the latest test has been updated or something. But the problem with this is that, well, there are two issues. One, no one's really sure that it measures anything. People have noted that if you take the implicit assumptions test or the IBT more than twice, your score changes with each test. So it could be simply that there might be a very mild bias the first time around, but you're actually picking what you think of as the second best answer the second time around, which would imply that this is pretty much meaningless when it comes to the day-to-day pace of human interactions. There's not much evidence that associating Blackness with wickedness 1% more than you associate whiteness with wickedness really predicts behavior. I think that's the biggest problem. There's not much evidence that that is an actual equivalence to traditional racism. So, I mean, condensing this into one sentence, there are a bunch of studies that find that IAT scores don't have anything to do with how you actually treat individuals at all. In fact, one recent study found that people who have higher implicit bias scores were less likely to express themselves in a racist fashion. And it's easy to think of reasons for that. I mean, people with higher implicit bias scores could be individuals from tough, integrated, say, Black-white environments, like the military, athletics, nursing, where you might have some hidden dislikes, but where you're also very aware that many people in that group are high performers. So you might be the least racist of, anyone analyzing this set of questions. Basically, I'm a classicist when it comes to this, and then I'll finish this off in a sentence because I'm a long talker. But I think that there are questions that when asked anonymously with respondents seated 6 feet apart really do measure how racist someone is. And to me, these are questions like, would you object to living next to a normal, non-criminal Black neighbor? Would you object to working for a normal, non-racist Black man? Would you object to hiring a white guy? And so on down the line. There are multiple 10-question scales that measure this. And if you the political scientist Eric Kaufman is good on this. If you actually ask intelligent adult individuals, for example, do you have a problem with interracial dating? Even if it's not for you, do you object to this? You know, any problem with it whatsoever? And should any laws be in place? The percent of people that really have a problem with this is on the order of 6%. So I think we know that there are very few people that are old school traditional racists. I don't even think on the quote unquote alt-right, you'd find many old school traditional want to live in an entirely monoracial society individuals. But as we've moved away from traditional racists being common, we've seen all these innovative attempts to redefine racism. Are you 1 second slower when it comes to clicking on the brown face? I'm not sure what that means. Certainly wouldn't mock the researchers, but I don't think that has much implication for society.
Let me share some revolutionary data. Rebecca
Okay.
Clapper, Newsweek, July 28, 2021. Hate crimes documented by police disproportionately list Black people as attackers, according to
Oh, yeah.
a new report by civil rights groups for better protection under hate crime laws. Yet, it is frequently proliferated in the media space that white men are committing these crimes, and they're also the ones who are attacking Asians.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll take that one on head on. So first of all, there's no doubt that Black Americans have a higher than average crime rate. When I say that in general, I'm a culturalist, or I make a kind of throwaway line like everyone has problems, what I'm referring to there is that you see different pathologies in different communities. So if you look at the rate of opiate use, sales, death, the rate of suicide, which can be very traumatic to everyone around you, the rate of corporate crime in white communities, those are obviously higher than they are in Black communities, assuming that either of those giant groups is in fact a community. But at any rate, when you look at a violent street level crime, the odds of Black people, who, even setting aside any potential issues in the culture, what are sometimes called pathologies, are a decade plus younger than white people, being overrepresented are very, very high. So yeah, Black people, as I recall, Black people are the only group overrepresented when it comes to commission of hate crimes. Whites are right around what you'd expect. And again, the majority of people are white. So there are more hate crimes targeting Blacks than there are hate crimes targeting whites. But Jewish Americans, Hispanics, Asians all commit these offenses at a lower rate than you would expect. To some extent, it's kind of the two longest tenured populations in the country beating each other up and both targeting Jews. And actually, this is part of one of a series of patterns. Hate crimes don't reflect what you'd expect. A substantial, although not minority or not majority, number of them involve a white victim. That's rarely discussed. The most targeted groups tend to be groups like Jews and sometimes gays. So race isn't necessarily the primary motivator at all. There are only about 7,000 hate crimes in a typical year. And I, of course, have written a book called Hate Crime Hoax, where I note that within any 5-year period of time, you're going to find hundreds of hoaxes in that data set, or narrative collapses at the very least. So the data is not what it's presented as being in the media. And I think for your listeners, or for that matter, mine, I mean, that'll sound like a return to a long running favorite song, because this is not a one-off incident. The last quick comment, the Asian data, I actually wrote an article about this for commentary, because it got to the point where it annoyed me as a right-leaning Black guy. We were seeing this constant attack. It's conservatives, it's white conservatives. These people, these MAGA, Trump, Groyper-loving bums are beating up Asians. If you actually watched 3 or 4 of the videos that were circulating on the internet, you began very rapidly to doubt whether that was the case. And I mean, I actually dug into the data. I mean, with a research associate, I was able to look at more than 100 of the cases that had occurred in the year in question. And I mean, more than 60% of them involved a attacker, quote unquote, of color. The majority of the minority attackers were Black. And it was a diverse group of bums. It wasn't, the white attackers weren't skinheads. They were, Irish American city kids. And so apparently crime increased as police pulled back during the pandemic post George Floyd. Some of that crime targeted Asians, and that tended to be brutal. You're talking about old women carrying cash, violent attacks, sometimes rapes. And Black people were very well represented in that, unfortunately. So no, you didn't see Klansmen attacking Asian women in a working class Chinatown, because there aren't any Klansmen, and they wouldn't go to Chinatown or to a Black neighborhood to commit crimes if there were. So that is the reality. Very, very often, the patterns that you see in mainstream mass media simply aren't real, while the patterns that you see with your own eyes often are.
And the definition of a hate crime is also quite ambiguous. If you're uninterested in affirmative action, one can call you a racist. Hate crimes are not properly defined, and this is another issue.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Well, a hate crime, the whole idea of hate crime, I mean, there's a famous comment about this from one of the grand old cops, I think maybe Bratton, who worked under Giuliani, but he just said something like, there ain't no crimes that are crimes of love. And that I think is what many people think when you hear the term hate crime or violence crime or something like that. I mean, what would the other options be if you're talking about something like a brawl? But a hate crime under US law is a criminal offense that targets individuals because of membership in a protected category. And protected categories state by state tend to gel pretty well with our Civil Rights Act. So, I mean, that would be, it'd be race in general. Whites are also covered. It would be sex in a number of cases. It would be ethnicity, nationality, religion. So if you target someone because they are a Black Jew, that is a hate crime. The problem is that many, many things are left out of US law on this front. So if you target someone because of social class, if you target someone because of something that's not recognized as a religion, if you target someone because of profession, say a banker, there would be no even potential hate penalty that would attach to that. So whether hate crimes are useful, I mean, I'm interested in your opinion, but that's something that's been debated really for years. Some people have argued for getting rid of the entire category. But as the category exists, there's a diverse range of perps. We, quote unquote, are actually overrepresented. And that is the reality. But a hate crime is a specific targeting of a protected group. It's not any crime just motivated by hatred or dislike.
And then look at the Southern Poverty Law Center. According to the SLPC, if a Black extremist attacks a white extremist because of his race, that is not a hate crime.
Really, the SPLC has
Yeah, some time ago I read an article along this line. I'm using my own examples, but this is the logical conclusion. So
well,
if a Black person were to attack another group, that's a hate crime. Remember, power is about race, and Black people cannot have power. So if a Black man attacks a white man, he's still a victim because Black people cannot have power. It's sloppy reasoning.
Well, I don't think the police tolerate as much of that as, the dons in the academic classrooms. In general, one thing that I will say is that whites are in almost every case protected by the civil rights laws. For when this is not really debatable. We did a side 1 week seminar on this when I was in law school. It is a fact. Many people at this time thought this was funny. There was some argument that it should be changed, but the race and ethnicity protections in US law would protect certainly an Irishman or an Italian or whatnot from an attack, but would also in general protect a white person from an attack. So every year, I mean, there are a certain number of hate crimes where the target is white. There are a certain number of hate crimes where the target's Jewish. There's still a few where the target's Irish, so on down the line. And those are prosecuted as thoroughly as any other crimes. There just aren't as many because, again, there are fewer minorities, although we have a higher crime rate in general. But the argument that you can't be racist unless you have privilege and power, I mean, to me, is just one of the legendary bad arguments that's out there in the game.
And Wilfred, I have a quick point to make. This argument is also demeaning Black people because it is suggesting that we're unable to be evil. And if you're not capable of engaging in illicit activities, you're basically a child.
Well, I think that's an excellent summary. In fact, I'm sometimes called anti-Black. In fact, I think I'm very pro-Black. And that, I mean, first of all, I'm not much of a racist one way or another. I mean, I don't spend a long time sitting around every day thinking about my ethnic identity, drinking bourbon. But in general, I want to see Black people, Celtic individuals, which is the other half of my background, natives, a little bit there, succeed. I would love to see consistent high performance from everyone in the US Black community and in everyone in America more broadly. I think that allegation, that negative label often comes from a refusal to praise failure, sort of. And yeah, I think we'll talk about whether there's still some small IQ differences or whether we have an advantage in certain things, physical athletics or whatnot. But the reality is that Black people, white people, everyone else are adult human beings, at least everyone
Exactly.
engaged in conversations like this. Yes. So to say foolish things like you can't even be a bigot because you're incapable of gaining power. So the most you're capable of is a sort of an ineffectual, helpless personal prejudice. No, I mean, that's absolutely foolish. I mean, first of all, I'm a tenured college professor, was an executive until quite recently. I mean, I've been powerful most of my adult life. Not surely by, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump standards, but the idea that I couldn't fire a white janitor if I wanted to is just bizarre. But again, the privilege power idea has a number of flaws, I think. And if you wanted to spell these out in kind of debate salon format, one would be that most whites don't have any power. I mean, I live in Appalachia. The second would be that many minorities do, and this often comes from working in collusion with other members of minority groups. So, for example, Barack Obama was the president of the United States, and he appointed his good friend, and if I recall correctly, fraternity brother, Eric Holder, as the Attorney General of the United States, broader fraternity. They didn't go to the same college. You see this sort of thing pretty often. Going beyond that to argue that somehow whites in bloc still have more power on average than Barack Obama would require sort of the fantastical imagining of an all-white ruling class, one, that every white belongs to, two. And I think that's clearly nonsense. But I also think if you read through Derek Bell, Robin DiAngelo, some of these people, I think they believe it. There's kind of the prose always teeters on the edge of mental instability, where you do get this impression of like the old idea that 5 Jews control the world has been replaced with the idea that 27 whites control the world, and that somehow everything that every white guy does is supported by this cabal. Unless you believe that, it's obviously insane in the literal sense of that term to say that a homeless Appalachian guy is more powerful than the president.
Well, I read an article in the New York Post recently, and students were being taught that wealthy Black students have less privilege than working class whites. So this is becoming mainstream in some quarters.
Well, I think one of the things, so I spent about a year doing, I think, pretty good public intellectual writing, but to some extent building a name. I put out some books. I mean, both of them were bestsellers in at least the Amazon sense. But I mean, one of the things I want to do this upcoming year is really get back into the state of models and test some of the claims that are becoming very popular and that are starting to circulate in kind of the softer social science journals. So, I mean, the privilege thing is an interesting one. I've stopped mentioning this as much because we never really got the full on, 10,000 person study set up yet. But a couple of years back, I actually took the scale of privilege that was designed, as I recall, by Ivy League grad students that led BuzzFeed, the website. And I don't know exactly the designers by name, of course, but that led BuzzFeed, the website, for a couple of weeks. Test your privilege. Many people have taken this, hundreds of thousands. And I gave this scale in settings where that was allowable, like classrooms, to a group of several hundred people. I mean, more than 500 in total, as I recall. And I looked at what affected the privilege score overall, like of all the variables that we then gathered on the survey document, the back page, race, age, sex, so on down the line. And what I found, and again, this is the preliminary round, but is that about 75% of privilege is just pure social class, i.e., a poor person on average would get a 17 or whatever it was on a 100-point well-known scale that included questions like, have you ever lost a fight? And have you ever gone to bed hungry? In contrast, the average rich kid would get something like a 64. So there's this enormous gap. In contrast, the Black-white gap with everything else adjusted for, including class, was like 2 points. So we can say that there is racism in society. And we can actually say that it has a statistically significant 3% or whatever the case might be impact. But we can also say, well, that's 3%, buck up, man. And we can note that the impact of class is 20 times that. So anyone that's teaching that race has more impact on Ivy League students than their social class is just a guru or a fakir. I mean, that's not a scientific finding. You've seen this a lot where someone will confront some intelligent person on the right, whether it's Larry Elder or Ben Shapiro or a quite serious scientist like John McWhorter, and they'll say, well, what you're saying seems to contradict X journal article. And Ben or John will look bemused and say, but X journal article says there are 3 sexes. And the respondent will then say, yes, but it's in X journal. And at some point, excuse the language, but you have to say, well, that it's bullshit despite that. Like the idea that class, it has much less effect on your life than race or being bisexual or something like that is just completely sourceless. Like there's no quantitative piece of evidence for that I've ever seen.
Wilfred, it is the battle between science versus scientism.
Sure.
Science is data, scientism is ideology. I don't know if you follow the literature on climate change passionately, but according to serious researchers and quantitative studies, there is no consensus that mass extinctions
Yes, right.
are correlated with rapid climate change. None.
That is correct. I think that with a lot of these things, so the term that I use for this is tough science, THUH, mocking some of the early pronouncements from East Coast governors about COVID. We're following the science here. And I think that glib or not, that's a pretty accurate term because it refers to sort of catered science that appears in certain mainstream, primarily non-quantitative journals that totally ignores things like the culturalist, much less the hereditarian argument for anything, so on down the line. That's really within the safe box. An editorial note in a journal arguing that we should lock down to prevent, just one life being lost under COVID is tough science. When you actually get into the full, across all top 100 journals in each field, the full debate that's going on, it's always voluminous and it's always fascinating. My take on climate change is pretty much like my take on COVID. Very early on, I think that I actually got something of a reputation as someone writing about COVID. I had almost no interest in COVID. I got the disease early on. I had a cold. At least apparently that's what it was. I've since been vaccinated. But my demographic group, males at my level of health, although I'm a bit chubby, the risk of death was about 1 in 10,000. So I wasn't very worried about it. But I noticed that the media coverage of the virus seemed to be sort of one part the science, one part tough science, and 8 parts panic. So very basic things were being ignored. For example, Reason magazine reported by June of last year that the IFR for COVID-19 was 0.26%. That means, of course, as you know, that everyone who was actually infected, about 1 person in 400 would die. Very elevated figures that we were seeing, like 4%, came simply because it was hard to get tests as a healthy young man or woman at the start of the pandemic. So this was known. This was a fact that in the scientific community was being widely discussed on the message boards and so on. We also knew the average victim was 81. That was the Times of India reporting on the dead in Italy in May of 2020. And that figure's been reconfirmed quite a bit. Both Alex Berenson and Pandemia and the sort of response papers going against that book say that the average is now 79. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. But we knew that the disease was serious. A 0.26 is about 4 times the worst flu we've seen. But we also knew it wasn't going to be epidemic. And we knew other things like lockdowns didn't do any good because people just broke the rules.
Wilfred, let me list the studies because I don't like pretentious people. So one person would argue lockdowns don't work. And this pretentious person in front of him would say, give data, even though they can't support the data themselves. So let me give some data. You already know data, but I'm going to give it anyway. Frontier in Public Health. No, they do not work. Journal of Clinical Investigation. No, they do not work. Wilfred Reilly. No, they do not work. National Bureau of Economic Research. Non-pharmaceutical interventions are unlikely to stem the spread of COVID. This is the data.
Yes, I'm glad you included my little piece in there. That originally, again, was just public intellectual, not necessarily a jest, but that went out and I believe spiked over in the UK. But the models still exist, and I've discussed them with serious physicians quite a few times. But yeah, what people were finding, my own analysis was pretty simple. I took the lockdown states and the non-lockdown states in the USA, and I took the metrics that I was interested in, which was hospitalizations and deaths. And I regressed against a number of things, including population density, age of the population, minority population. Anyone competent to teach in college could have done this. And what I found was that there were more deaths in the more deaths in the lockdown states because of things that they were doing, like sending sick seniors back into nursing homes and then not letting people in that nursing home population leave because there is a lockdown going on. People were going home with their sick relatives because they did the worst thing possible. They waited about a week after the disease hit the major East Coast states to declare a lockdown, and so on and so forth. But my point with COVID-19 is simply just, we knew from the start that this was a serious bug. It was 4 times flu. There was no reason we couldn't have said that. There's no reason we couldn't have said, wear a mask if you want to, shop for your grandmother, and recognize the death toll is going to increase by 200,000 to 300,000. This is what the Swedes did. They treated their population like full-on adults. As we've just said, we want Black Americans to be treated. You know, if there's a crime statistic that makes Black people look bad, we need to discuss that. What can we do to stop it in the Black community? Anyway, that's what COVID was. The problem was the hysteria about COVID. The problem was people presenting COVID like it was the Black Plague come again. I mean, there are cities in many states where the schools are still shuttered. If the kids are allowed to go, they're wearing 2 masks and they're eating lunch on pails outside. This is not a joke. So none of that is based at all in reality. It's based in tough science and a desire to panic. And getting back to your point, which is a good point, just leading off before my 5-minute discussion of COVID, I do feel the same way about climate change. I don't think that there is no climate change.
Climate is always changing, and we have always adapted. This is what studies show. Even the data and studies are also clear for Africa, especially Ghana.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, so the Swedish model right now, the Scandinavian model, I guess would be more appropriate to call it, predicts a 2.4 degree increase, and that's probably Celsius even, in global temperature within 125 years. So I think that's real, and I think humans contribute to that. So 2.4 degrees, said 4.2 degrees with the adjustment. Okay. The problem is, though, that's at the end of that's the year 2150 would be when that projection, given current levels of emission, is supposed to come true, supposed to occur. And again, I might be making a few small mistakes there, but it seems obvious to me that if private enterprise and common sense functionality are allowed to do their job, this will be a very, very minor problem, as Y2K was, for example, as global cooling was, when that was projected in the 70s, actually apparently occurred for a couple of years. As every one of these incidents, killer bees and the Great Northerly Migration has proven to be. My worry with climate change is not that the climate is going to warm and it's going to kill us all. We've known how to build seawalls literally since ancient Rome and Ashanti. My worry with climate change is that the government will implement draconian COVID-style measures to quote unquote fight the end of the world, and will take a very strong-handed approach to citizens who object. And that might sound like kind of a joke, but I mean, you look at what's happening with COVID in Australia. They're not running concentration camps, quote unquote, but they certainly are rounding up sick white and Aboriginal kids in, the backlands area of the country and shipping them unwillingly to places that at least 3 people have tried to escape from. So will we see this same thing? You can only drive 2 days a week to save our friends in Somalia or something like that. It's a hypothetical, but quite possibly.
Some of the events being discussed pertaining to Australia are exaggerated, but I get your point. There's actually an article in Quillette attacking some of the people promoting misinformation, but I get your point clearly. And back to vaccines, study in the European Journal of Epidemiology, vaccination rates not linked to lower COVID rates. I actually have an article on the topic for the Midas Institute. Vaccines reduce the viral load. Take a vaccine. When you take the vaccine, you're benefiting yourself. You're not doing your neighbor a favor. Vaccinated people can contract COVID and spread it. But to be on the safe side, take the vaccine because it reduces the viral load, and not all vaccines are equal. Pfizer has a better track record when compared to J&J.
Yeah, no, I think I don't have much to say there. I think that's a good, intelligent, again, sort of adult summary. Things aren't extraordinarily simple much of the time. I mean, so with COVID-19, I'm vaccinated. I'm fully vaccinated. And I'm reasonably glad I made that health decision. Whether or not it makes a lot of sense as a healthy adult male that has gone through the disease, why not get that extra boost? But again, I was never terrified of COVID in the first place. I think the vaccines do work, but I mean, you're very correct to point out some of the obvious caveats. So the thing about the vaccines that does keep them in that medical miracle category, I would say, is that they seem to be about 88 to 92% effective at preventing serious outcomes, by which I mean death and hospitalization for you. You're absolutely right that a lot of the things that were promised early on, like they'll prevent you from getting COVID at all, don't seem to be true, especially against the new quote unquote Omicron variant. They don't seem to stop you from spreading COVID. I haven't seen any good published research on whether you're less likely to do so. Really could just be an oversight on my part. Again, what you do see, though, is kind of the hysterical response of science to an imperfect reality that people are fully prepared to discuss. I mean, as I understand, Twitter said a couple days ago that they were going to ban anyone from the platform, not suspend, who said that vaccinated people could spread COVID.
But they can. Vaccinated people can transmit the disease and contract it. This is the data.
Yes, there's no. This is the thing. It's not disputed. We've moved into, with a lot of the things that both you and I talk about, we've moved into a weirdly Orwellian zone because people aren't being censored for telling lies. They're being censored for telling the truth. If I were to present crime data that was absolutely valid and say that blacks or poor whites or young males had an extremely high crime rate, I would get an extraordinarily large backlash. I still do this every couple of days just to practice my arguing skills, but I would get an extraordinary backlash, and it wouldn't be based on the fact that that's not true. It would be based on the fact that you shouldn't say it, or that could cause tensions, or our platform's rules prohibit hate speech. The ultimate example of this, of course, is the trans debate, where people like Colin Wright have gotten in trouble for saying, well, there are two biological sexes.
There are only two. Sex is immutable. You cannot change your sex. And the truth is that there is a new line of data arguing that trans people, some of them suffer from physiological and psychological problems, and this could be leading to them wanting to transition.
Well, all of this, and I mean, this is true for kind of this whole conversation. I mean, I had the same feeling with unregistered university, for example. It's fun to talk about, and yeah, social media, if we put it in the header, would probably block every episode posted. But no, I mean, a lot of these conversations are based on obvious fact and are censored not because they are non-factual, but because they're factual. And getting back to your actual point, a lot of the obvious facts, are extraordinarily clear. So, I mean, with transgenderism, it's been known for decades that there are multiple reasons that people choose to identify as trans. I mean, a substantial population of males, as I understand, are what is called autogynephilic, where they're extremely aroused by the thought of themselves as a woman being quote unquote taken. They enjoy wearing women's clothing and so on. And a lot of the descriptions of femininity that you see debating or reading trans writers online seem to fall directly in line with this. Like there's a famous quote, like, when I am a woman, I am what a woman is, just hungry eyes and open legs or something like that. And there's a pretty obvious psychological place that comes from. I guess the accepted, again, science view is that everyone who identifies as trans has the actual brain of an actual woman implemented or somehow mistakenly lodged in the body of a male. And so they should be treated as a woman in every circumstance. And that somehow bleeds over into the idea that sex itself is this kind of pliable, manipulable thing. So, I mean, there's the famous graphic in Scientific American showing the sex spectrum with intersex people on it and so on. And not only is that itself scientifically in error, most intersex people are very clearly primarily identifiable as one sex or the other. There's also just sort of a practical point, which is that most people who identify as trans aren't intersex. So the question isn't, is there 0.5% of the population that we must honorably, treat as they wish to be treated? The question is, if I'm me, I'm a 200-pound, fully biological man with an 1X, 1Y chromosomal order and a penis and a beard, can I say I'm a woman? And the socially acceptable answer would be yes. You can say you're a woman, and not only that, you must be treated as a woman in every situation. So a friend of mine, the kind of last comment, but he growing up a little slowly, he still gets in brawls and so on. One of his comments recently was, if I ever go to jail, I'm immediately going to identify as a woman. And in our state, there would seem to be no barrier to doing that. This could be an error if you look at Kentucky and Ohio, but it's more than a good, funny joke. It's something that I'm fairly sure people are doing. So we've created this idea of the flexibility of sex. I don't think that, quote unquote, God did. I don't think that's something that exists in nature.
I am happy that you're talking about womanhood. There's a popular saying, a woman is, sorry, not a woman is born, not made. I can't remember the saying at the present moment, but the saying was popularized by a philosopher who argued that one becomes a woman. So there's the assumption that woman would, it is mutable. You can become a woman, you choose to become a woman or a man. It is not set in stone. But the feminists, they're going to get the end of the stick
Yes.
because gender quotas, I'm not in favor of gender quotas for economic purposes. According to the literature, there's no relationship between gender quotas and firm profitability. And I like to cite the studies post and a study that was published in a journal of financial in the journal of financial economics. But if men are able to identify as the opposite sex, then they can benefit from the gender quota,
Yes.
therefore disprivileging women. Men do not have the history of womanhood. They don't have that legacy of discrimination. So
Absolutely.
the transgender movement is actually robbing women of privileges.
Yeah, I once gave a speech, and I wish I could find a copy of this on my current comp, but I was talking about the left wing in the USA, and my argument was that the attempt on the left, especially under Barack Obama, was to create sort of a French style coalition of the fringes. So the idea was that everyone who felt themselves oppressed by, the white man in the gray suit, could come together and could topple that opponent and then share the spoils. And of course, you never want your country to be, a carcass for spoils, but that seemed to be the narrative. But part of the speech was that I didn't think this was going to be all that successful, at least past the first few victories, because the partners in the coalition had nothing in common. There's nothing that traditionalist Muslim Arabs, who I in general rather like, by the way, but have in common with flamboyant gay men on most issues. There's nothing that union workers and illegal immigrants have in common on most issues, except perhaps Catholicism. There's nothing that, and this was the big one, trans people and feminists have in common, because the whole point of the later feminist movement with the riot girls and the girlies and the ethical sluts and all that stuff was that you can be a woman and be anything you want as long as you have a vagina and a confident brain. That's literally a quote. So now people are saying, well, I don't need a vagina and confidence is questionable. This used to be diagnosable as a mental condition, but I am a woman because I say I am. And yeah, that's going to invade an incredible number of feminist spaces. I mean, yes, you're talking about gender quotas, but you're also talking about things like competitive violence sports, where, I mean, you've seen people like Fenn and Fox enter and move into the top 10s in the rankings. The best ranked college swimmer in the USA right now, if I have that correct, is a transgender woman. So identifies as such. And is beating the girls by like 38 and 42 seconds in specific races. If you ever watch swimming, that's about a third of the race. So, I mean, you've got in California, this goes a little further, where you now can go to prison as a male, I'll say, in a women's facility if you identify as a woman. So a lot of this stuff, you again get back to this to science root, which is something from the softer social sciences or even the humanities that sounds good, but that just doesn't stand up to the kind of modern interrogation either you or I would do. So of course you can say you become a woman. You are born an innocent young girl and you learn your manners and you, in the West, we'd say lose your virginity, have your first love, you get a job, you get married. I mean, yeah, of course you become a woman, but the starting point of becoming a woman traditionally has been that you were a girl. You were a non-mature biological female and you became a mature biological female. And in most cases, you entered into a relationship with a mature biological male. We're now saying that you can identify as basically any of those categories. There are even people that say age play is possible. I'm living as a 6-year-old girl. So
Yes, after loud, people are just so reasonable.
no, but there are quite a few of these things. And again, I believe it was in Denmark that a claim was actually successful in the courts. Someone was 60 and they wanted to list their age as say 36 because they thought it'd make them more attractive on the dating market. Well-off guy, nice car, they're just a little too old. I don't mean to make fun of people that have a mental condition of whatever severity, but I don't really see much of a gap in the argument here, especially now that we're moving beyond the traditional genders when it comes to being trans. So the new wave, as you know, is people saying, well, I'm not trans. I'm not a woman that thinks I'm a man, or whatever better way to say that. I'm not a woman female that identifies as a male.
You're non-binary.
Yeah, you're non-binary. The best one I've heard so far from a girl flirting with one of my friends on TikTok was demon self. So I identify as an edgy, non-human creature, and her pronouns were like Deem Bay. So like, you're my demonic, kinky girlfriend, you're Deem Bay. So you would use these binary pronouns, like instead of saying, hey, that's his wallet, you would say, you know, hey, that's Deem Bay's sexual toy. Don't touch it. You know, and it was demon self. So instead of themself, you would say demon self. And I think that a certain cadre of mostly white gentry liberals is actually going to talk like this. These are the people that say Latinx and say African American.
Oh, quick point,
guy.
Wilfred. People of Latino descent, they don't like that term. This is what the data show.
Well, yeah, because again, this gets into the unintentional. So I think something that really underlies a lot of what we're both saying as intelligent Black men is this piece that came out, I believe, the Washington Post a couple of years ago, citing a couple of good studies that found that people who identify as strongly politically liberal make themselves sound much stupider when they talk to their Black friends. It was referred to as like dumbing down their language, and it'd go from complex words to like, hey, bro, let me tell it to you like this. No such effect was observed for conservatives, very conservatives, or for moderates. Although some people in those groups didn't like Blacks. It was just the conservative athletes and soldiers and so on just talked to Black people like people. But this was an almost universal effect among left-wingers. And I think that this kind of gets into a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, which is almost unconscious colonialism, where you'll see people from these very advanced, slightly different cultures, you know, South American, Caribbean, and you'll say, well, those poor fools are, you know, the same skin color as the poor fools here at home. We must tell them how to be. And that's where you get these weird ideas, like promoting a genderless version of Spanish. I mean, that's what Latinx is. It's part of a general idea to remove the general move to get the O and A pronouns out of Espanol. The problem with this, of course, is that Spanish is a wholly gendered language. I don't know whether you speak it, no soy fluente.
Yeah, I was taught by brilliant Spanish teachers, and some of my teachers were fluent in multiple languages. So I am quite aware that some languages are actually gendered. This is what intelligent people know.
Yeah, and in Spanish is utterly gendered. Everything has a gender. So like the book I'm reading is El Libro, because men are traditionally expected to master reading for their accounts and so on. But your girlfriend would be la novia, the cute little girl, because she is a woman and she would have a feminine pronoun. But like everything falls in. I mean, a dog is el perro, you know, so.
Ella and Ella, we know this.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, there's no way to have a gender-free Spanish language. The words would make no sense.
It wouldn't be Spanish.
Yes. It also wouldn't be possible. Like El Padex. Like okay. Anyway, the attempt to degender Spanish, I think, is an example of something we don't talk enough about, which is liberal colonization. The idea that you are going to another country to tell them how to be, but this time it's not to stop throwing widows into the bonfire or to use a few less spices in the cooking. It's to change their sexual identity. So you have these bizarre Groucho Marx sounding campaigns like Queers for Palestine is probably the best I've ever seen. And there's a certain mindset that produces Queers for Palestine, and it's a uniquely Western, upper middle class, modern world thing.
Yes. Wilfred. Yeah, on the issue of I have to share this snippet with our guests again. It's about the vaccine. Lancet new study. Stigmatizing the unvaccinated is unjustified. But back to the trans issue. Animals. Human beings are able to own animals. If John Brown decides to identify like a dog, should he be owned by Walter Smith? Should we allow that? Should the legal system allow a man to identify as a dog and be owned by a human being?
Of course not, because it's just all pointless bullshit. I mean, so these questions, my general response when I'm asked something like this in academic conferences, that's a fascinating question that has a lot of implications. The reality, of course, I think for most of us would be, no, we shouldn't allow adult human males to be owned like dogs.
Obviously.
I mean, yes, of course.
But
I mean,
the logical conclusion of the trans movement is to allow an adult male to be owned as a dog. That's the logical conclusion.
to some extent, yeah. So what I was going to say a bit earlier is I don't see a distinction between the transgender argument. I'll probably get some heat for this online, but whatever. I don't see a distinction between the transgender argument and things like the transracial argument at all.
Not at all.
So
There isn't this parallel. There are parallels.
yes, but the trans argument, what they'll say if you bring this up is, well, gender identity disorder or whatever it's called today, gender dysphoria is a medical condition. It's not extraordinarily serious, but it is recognized. So there are certain people who are born male who identify very strongly with the style, gear, appearance, sexual tastes, so on of women. Okay. And this is a valid enough claim, but there are two things that go into this argument that make it one we're supposed to take dead seriously. The first claim is that how you identify matters. I think this is something we sometimes pass over too often on the high IQ right. We'll say, well, I'll give you your argument. Okay, there is gender, but that itself is a pretty iffy idea. I mean, I myself feel that I feel I'm the best driver and lover in the world. I would assume many confident males feel this way. Is that real? Almost certainly not.
That's why I call that the beast.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just like everyone feels this kind of crap about themselves. Like I was playing a little basketball earlier today. I was guarding a guy in the gym. And every time he took a 3-point shot, he would say something cocky like, that's that fire. That's going in. That's money. That's 3 points. And I'm a decent player. And this guy made maybe a third of his shots. Now, he's not going to change his confidence. He probably played a little in college, something like this. But are we required to accept his perception of himself as an athlete at 36 as real? No, I don't think so. And that's the argument with gender. So first of all, it's true that people claim they identify with a sex other than their own. The question is how to treat that. We'll set that aside for now. But the second argument made against, say, transracialism is that this is unique. And I don't see why it is, really. I mean, I don't see any reason that you couldn't identify with a race other than your own in terms of the stereotypical cuisine, music, dress style, so on of that group. Like, if a white kid walked into one of my classrooms wearing baggy, expensive sweatpants, a Negro Leagues baseball jersey and a ball cap and said, well, I am Caucasian, I recognize that at some level, but I identify very strongly as Black. I think my render is, Black as a Negro, quote unquote. I mean, I personally probably just laugh at that because we're not there socially, but there's not a dramatically different argument between that and saying I'm a 6'2" male, but I identify as a woman. So at root, the real question here gets all the way down to kind of Mill and Locke versus Foucault and Derrida. Does identity matter? If I say I identify as something, does that make a difference? Should you be forced to recognize it? And if we say that you are what you identify as, then yes, that opens the door to transracialism and all the things people joke about online. I don't see any particular reason you wouldn't be expected to respect someone who is a BDSM sub and says that she prefers to live as a puppy. I don't think we'll get there because I think this will just be laughed out of the room, but I'm not sure there'll be a logical reason it should be.
Back to the issue of age transitioning, the case in Europe was rejected. There was a European case. I don't remember which country, but it was rejected. But maybe you were referring to a different case. So Wilfred, we're going to move on a bit to talk briefly about IQ.
All right.
America is a cognitive meritocracy. This is the name of an academic paper. And I do agree with the conclusion. If you look at the data, the average SAT scores for Blacks are lower than whites and Asian. And the intelligence, religiosity, and even political preferences are heritable. I do believe in the heritability of traits and long-term evolutionary pressures. However, culture complements IQ. Someone with an IQ of 70 can work in an ordinary job, but an individual with an IQ of 100 may do a better job, get a promotion, and earn more money. Someone with an IQ of 70 may work hard, but with the right culture is going to get a promotion. And this is one explanation to shed light on the variation in incomes when we're talking about Southeast Asians and Black Americans. The IQ for Vietnam is 89.5. This is not exceptionally high, but Vietnamese Americans, they do well. So maybe just the success of some Asian groups is explicable by culture, not necessarily high IQ.
Yeah, so I think that when I get into the race and IQ debate, and again, I'm a well-trained quantitative social scientist,
Yes,
but
I know.
but I'm saying, but psychometrics actually aren't my field. So this is something I think I can discuss coherently, probably not quite as strong as the criminal justice or poli-sci stuff that I write primarily in. I became interested, so I guess I'll do my intro and then go into my position here. I became interested in this because the paradigm of culturalism seemed to be sadly neglected. There are obviously a number of writers like Thomas Sowell and Richard Nisbett that have pointed out that culture and very measurable cultural variables like the presence of a father in the home for X number of hours per day, things you can quantify, dramatically predict how groups do in life as versus every possible dependent variable, every metric of performance. There are people that have noted that the black-white IQ gap, I believe this was John McWhorter in Losing the Race, essentially closes if you adjust for a very small number of things like father in the home, number of books in the home, grades your parents say they expect, and number of hours spent studying per day. He discusses each of these in a different paragraph, but I'll never forget that sort of simple analysis. This argument strikes me as being largely correct, whether or not there's a genetic, say the black-white IQ gap is currently 10 points, half of that's genetic. We're not talking about, and I don't believe this to be the case, but in that situation, we're not talking about a 70 versus 100 IQ. And I agree with your analysis there, by the way. We're talking about a gap of 4 to 5 points.
Yes.
It seems to me that the things going on in the background of your life would have far, far more influence on how you perform than that 4 to 5 points. And it was an issue for me that this simply wasn't being pointed out by anyone. And this is actually Steve Saylor on the hard right is the one that made this point. This is due to a tactical problem in American politics. The American left, which is where culturalism sort of used to dwell, Sowell was kind of the right-wing outlier, has moved away from the idea that anything but racism can be responsible for minority problems. So, I mean, Ibram Kendi, as we've noted, says that any gap in performance between groups is due to racism. So all of these very basic things, like the number of books in a home and the number of words heard by a younger child boosts IQ. Father in the home has an advantage, at least on scholastic performance, if not on IQ, so on down the line. All that fell out of fashion because it was seen as blaming the victim. Why don't blacks have fathers?
Family privilege. This is what they say today.
Yeah, but it's just nonsensical. So it struck me that to a large extent, the debate, once you acknowledge, okay, racism's one factor in the model, call it experience bias, the rest of the debate seemed to be between this culturalist paradigm and hereditarianism, which had, fallen even further out of fashion, but there's still a home for that on the hard right. So I started looking at the culturalist writing and I found it very, very persuasive. Essentially, what we're looking at with the cult hered debate on IQ is one very simple question. And that is IQ is heritable. It's between 55 and 80% heritable. Could a currently extant 10-point gap fall into the range of individual and group IQ that is not genetically heritable? And running basic mathematical calculations, yeah, it easily could. The question is, does it? My take on IQ would be that cultural variables like the ones that I've discussed massively influence IQ. That's simply an obvious fact. I mean, you're obviously familiar with the Flynn effect, the IQ
yes.
of the entire world. Yeah, IQ of the entire world.
But the Flynn effect is real but debatable. There are some who argue that the Flynn effect was not necessarily measuring G, but rather specific cognitive skills that evolved with economic development. You get the point.
That's quite right. But I mean, the question is almost what difference does that make? The best analogy to this I've heard was from, I believe, Russell Warren. But there's a distinction between the ultimate physical potential of your body, which is at least one way to look at G, and the level of physical performance you'll get if you regularly access the gymnasium, which is the different skills, writing, mathematics, and so on. And they're all, of course, highly correlated. But in reality, what we saw over the past 100 years, I believe Flynn himself dates the start of his work to the waves of immigrants that arrived in the 19 teens. But what you've seen over the past 100 years or so is that the average IQ on tests normed as they would be today has grown from 84 to 100 in the USA and most Western countries. And this is extremely important for a number of reasons, but one of the most obvious is simply that taking the lowest bound estimate of Black IQ I've seen recently, which is 86, Black Americans today are smarter, quote unquote, before we dig into every G measure, than white Americans were in, say, 1938 or 1945. So taking IQ as the explanation for things like high crime rates in Black communities simply doesn't make sense. Even if you accepted that Black Americans have the same IQ today, 90, 91, as Romanians, that wouldn't explain why there's 10 times the murder rate that there is in Romania. And by looking at the increases in the murder rate since the 1960s, as well as the horrible things that have befallen our white countrymen in terms of opiates, suicide, so on, I think we can say pretty obviously that things like the effect of welfare on fatherhood are what is actually responsible there. The IQ point is interesting, but almost a side point. If you say Black people have a slightly lower IQ, okay, well, why wasn't there a dramatically higher Black crime rate in 1927? The argument doesn't hold together. I think
the argument sounds a bit insensible because genetics and psychological research has evolved. It is moving beyond the IQ to explain long-term evolutionary selection pressures and personality traits and genetic variants that are associated with these traits. This is my own view. IQ is important, but some genetic variants associated with traits linked to educational attainment, self-control, and risk tolerance are supplementing IQ. This is what I have been observing based on the data. It is not that there are genes coding for academic performance or entrepreneurship, but some genetic variants are closely linked to these outcomes, and they're more prevalent in some populations.
I think maybe.
It's tentative. It's tentative. The literature is tentative, but this is where the literature is heading.
Yeah, the GWAS stuff or
yes.
the SAT stuff. Yeah, so I think a couple of things there. Every point here is interesting, and it's always good to debate this from a serious empirical standpoint, as opposed to, people screaming Nazi and so on at each other. My own take, first, so the question when you describe the many complex genes that predict human performance, the question is not, are there gaps between groups? It is, to some extent, how large are those gaps? And actually, I guess the first question would be, what are the groups? So I think race exists, but not in the sense that white explorers in the 17 teens thought that it did. I talked to some of the genomics companies for my latest book, Taboo, for example. And what 23andMe would say, for example, is that there clearly are, say, 8 or 9 large human populations, divisible into maybe 65 smaller ones, that can be distinguished from one another with what are called SGVs, segregated genetic variants. This strikes me as clearly true. I mean, it's not especially hard to describe what an Irishman or an Italian or an Ethiopian looks like. And the vision that our eyes are seeing seems to reflect reality. So when you take not the old races where people would ask idiotic questions like, are Irishmen and Turks white? These broad categories, Caucasian, which 23andMe would split into 2 or 3 categories, West Asian and so on. But when you take the modern genetic haplotypic populations, I don't see any doubt that those exist. I've had good debates about this online with people like Mazzucato on the left, but I mean, I think that the argument that they do is incredibly strong. If you look at the best marathon runners in the world, for example, something like 22 of the top 30 come from a 200-mile region in East Africa where the Kalenjin tribe lives.
And this is why, Wilfred, we need to pay attention to what economists call the biogeographic roots of development. I'm a big fan of the deep roots literature.
Definitely, but the second thing that would follow up when people get into the genetic roots of culture and this sort of thing, the second point that I would make to follow up on this, though, is that when we've been able to identify real group gaps, they tend to be extremely small. So for an upcoming article, I was actually interested. So everyone agrees Kalenjin are the best runners in the world. I was, however, interested in what the difference is between the best Kalenjin and the best white. And it turns out it's about 4 minutes. The white record in the marathon is something like 2:05. The Kalenjin record is 2:01:02. So these are the sort of things we actually see when we go under the surface with serious scientific tools. The Asian record was 206. And I think that order is about what you'd expect. Black West Africans, who we think of as sort of the bigger brothers you see in America and the Caribbean, were a bit behind the Asians, 208, something like that. So our differences like that, like a 7-minute gap across the 4 leading groups across 26 miles, is that possible? Yes. I don't see why there's such hysterical resistance to that idea. We're very used to the fact that gaps 3 or 4 times that large exist between men and women, for example. But when we get into genetic IQ, or when you get into IQ, the equivalent gap would be 3.2 points. Is that possible at a genetic level? I suppose. Again,
and this is why when I interview specialists in genetics on the show, I tell them that the latest, the new frontier is psychological differences, and I want good data, so I like to give them homework. I don't appreciate speculation. We shouldn't be speculating when information is just accelerating. That's insensible. It makes no sense.
True, but I mean, so a lot of this, and I don't think you're saying this directly at that recent point. I mean, that would be the measure of the IQ gap. The question, the race and IQ debate, and I think you're expanding this into the race and psychological factors debate, is an interesting one. And there really are points on all sides. I think that one of the problems a lot of people have with this is the involvement of it with sort of SJWs that want to frantically shut it down, the alt-right on the other side. People wonder, is this a serious conversation? In reality, of course, there is serious GWAS, for example, work being done. So my only point here was, so there are differences between, one, human haplotypic populations exist. It's important to distinguish those from the old incorrect races, which would classify a Malay and a Chinese, a Han, both as Asians, for example. 2, there are some slight differences between these groups, Kenyan versus non-Kenyan black versus white, distance running times. But 3, those gaps are pretty small. The equivalent gap in IQ terms would be about 3 points.
Small gaps can have big consequences.
At the ends of the distribution, yes. But I mean, with black IQ, I think it's important that we, if we're going to talk about this, figure out what the end result for that population would be. For example, I recently read and reviewed Charles Murray's Facing Reality. Good book. But he casually mentions at one point, well, the black IQ is lower than the white IQ. It's 91. And my reaction to that is, well, I read the bell curve.
A 9-point difference. What is the white IQ? Like a little over 100?
Yeah, it's a 100, a little higher, yes.
Yeah.
But no one disputes that there's still a gap. The point is, however, that Murray reached fame by writing the bell curve, which argued that the black IQ is about 84. So we've seen within, 22 years, we've seen an 8-point jump in the same population IQ that's clearly not genetic. I mean, Nigerian immigration could have affected that at the margins, but we see this sort of thing all the time. So when you see that, you can't just say, well, oh, the gap just shrunk by half, but genes still play a big role. You have to start seriously unpacking this. And this is where I think everyone gets to the GWAS work, which is, are there genes that correlate with, say, educational attainment? And can we, across populations, examine the frequency of this gene set and see what we can expect in terms of intellectual performance? The papers that I've read in this field are actually fascinating, but again, they don't seem to confirm. The most interesting that I've read actually is a paper by Kevin Bird. Are you familiar with this guy?
Kevin Bird, what's the name of the paper?
Kevin Bird, let's pull this up. Oh, it's actually called something very recognizable, like Still No Case for Hereditarianism. But let me look for. Yeah, Kevin Bird, no support for
Michigan State. Okay, I'll do some more research on him.
Yeah, but I mean, so the thing about Kevin Bird, just being very upfront, as I prefer to be, Bird is on the left. And Bird didn't like the idea of this sort of S&P research at all. But he actually looked at group differences in rate of possession of these alleles associated with academic attainment. And if you read the end of his paper, his conclusion is that about 15% of the black-white IQ gap, and he's free to challenge me if he disagrees with that, is due to genetic factors, which again, these sort of differences exist between groups pretty frequently. But that gets us back into the zone of, okay, the gap is now 10 points, and no one says it's more than half genetic. He says it's 15% genetic. we're talking, let's say 2 points, 2.5, let's give them the argument. That's plausible. I don't necessarily believe that, but I think that's what we're talking about. And I think the reason I bother to argue this sometimes is that you'll frequently see people on kind of the alti fringe of that hereditarian argument say things like, well, the average African IQ is 70. And no, it's not. I mean, that's like saying the average Albanian IQ is 79. Again, you might get to that residual small gap between two different populations in very poor countries. But if you took an Albanian and brought him to America, his children would average at the normal 99. I mean, I have no doubt that's the case.
And Wilfred, another compelling facet in the discourse is that, well, I should not say is that, so let me give you some background. Michael Woodley of Meany, he wrote a paper, he's very big on dysgenics, and Jonathan Beauchamp, I don't know if I'm pronouncing Jonathan's name right, he responded. So there's an argument that, okay, IQ scores are increasing. However, based on the evidence, selection is dysgenic. So this is another part of the debate. Why is IQ score increasing in the context of dysgenic selection?
This is actually a point. I'm making an upcoming article for the Journal of Black Thought, I believe would be the title, maybe Free Black Thought. But I mean, that's actually an extremely strong point for IQ and trait culturalism when you think about it.
Gene culture co-evolutions.
Well, it's the mimetic evolution, I think, would be the explanation to some extent. People have been asking this since Darwin's time, right? I mean, the original idea of social Darwinism was that if you simply allowed subsidy programs for the poor and non-competitive to continue, you'd wind up with idiocracy. You'd wind up with a society full of poor, fat, non-functional people. And although we do seem to have more of a tendency toward lard here in the USA these days, that simply hasn't happened. I mean, we've been conducting the PISA exam every year for the past, whatever it is, 32 around the world, in America, the West, so on.
Has been declining.
Well, we've declined the past couple of years by actually that gets into a lot of different things. The Flynn effect, according to some people, has stabilized over the past 4 or 5 years. So IQ is no longer increasing in the developed West. I would tend to agree with that.
It's reversing.
Well, it's got 1 point lower. But I think when you look at PISA scores overall, something you have to do is also look at changing population demographics. So the white PISA score in the USA has been pretty stable if it hasn't increased. This is despite what would now be a century of somewhat dysgenic social policy going back to the progressive era. So I guess my main point is that is a point for culturalism. There's no other way to look at it. If 20% of your males and females are no longer dying every year, but your performance remains stable, it would stand to reason that the mimetic technologies in society, our tools for exam training, our lack of fear, devoting the resources of the brain to something other than thinking, so on down the line, that those have had an effect on the process and pattern of thought in our society. So that would be my claim, and an interesting debate down the road maybe. But when you look at test scoring, I think I'm almost moving to a side point here. It doesn't make sense to say that US scores have gone down or that they've gone up at the upper end because the population has changed dramatically. For the book Taboo, I actually isolated white scores on the SAT, and they were remarkably stable. I mean, I believe it was a 1076 at the start of my study period, and the test used to be a little more difficult, and it was an 1118 last year. So I would assume that much larger variance in the national average score is simply caused by the fact that the US population has gone from 90 to 60% white, if we're being honest about this. Like Caucasian Hispanics, and again, this is a culturalist point, but score at about the same level as blacks, and no one's really sure why. I mean, language fluency is the obvious elephant in the room.
A new lucid point. So some argue that if IQ declines, then economic growth will decline, because there's a real relationship between IQ and economic growth, and many of these studies are actually quite new. But I am arguing the reverse. Presently, we are at a very high stage of civilizational complexity, and when a civilization becomes more complex, it is actually easier to create wealth. You can make millions as an influencer. One girl somewhere, she found a Dorito and it looked a bit weird and she sold it online for a lot of money. There's another young man, his name is Larry. He's in the business of helping people to locate weird objects related to video games. So when an economy becomes more complicated, it's actually easier for people to get rich. So even if IQ scores are declining because we're at such a high level of civilizational complexity, the economy will continue to grow.
I think that that's very possible. I mean, so this goes well beyond race, and I'm kind of
Yeah,
glad
we're
to
not
hear
talking about race again.
I'm fine either way. But no, I think the IQ conversation goes well beyond race, actually, as did the bell curve itself. So I think a couple things here. First, there's no necessary reason that growing or even becoming more diverse would lower IQ. If you want to look at this from kind of a cynical leader's perspective, we could at any time, the population leans dramatically in this direction, implement legislation that would institute actual merit immigration. They've done a pretty good job of this in Canada. So to some extent, except perhaps for the conflicts caused by diversity, it doesn't much matter whether a doctor with an IQ of 120 entering the country is of Black Caribbean origins, Indian origins, Eastern European origins. They're going to play the same role with the same IQ. So to some extent, it would be a conscious decision, at least if you're looking at immigration effects, to lower our IQ. I hope we don't do that and would strive to avoid it in any kind of leadership role, to be honest. The broader question of if national IQ does drop, will GDP drop?
It depends. It depends on the rate of the drop.
Yeah, it depends on that. It also depends on how we respond. I mean, if you assume that we are still going to be an open access democracy in the sense we are now, probably. I mean, you could also see a greater consolidation of power among a high IQ technocratic elite that would set policies designed to maximize productivity with less citizen input that we've seen so far. And historical examples, there's some that obviously come to mind. I mean, Rome had similar dysgenic policies for a while. I mean, you had an extraordinarily large population in the major cities known as the mob that was fed by the welfare style of Nona. They literally gave bread and entertained it with circuses. Roman GDP, although it's a bit hard to measure in that sort of mercantilist.
Wilfred, we're going into another territory, and this is the territory that I really like to talk about. Economic growth. When we talk about economic growth, should we care about the skills of the population or the skills of the elite? Based on what I've been reading, elites are crucial to growth.
I think that's true. By the way, I have to hop off in about 10 to 15 minutes.
Not a problem.
All right. But I enjoyed talking to you. These normally go about an hour, but I would have continued this one, except I got a message saying I have to do a TV hit at 6.
All right.
But, okay, so I think it depends. First of all, obviously, both are ideal. What you would want from a leadership perspective, and I suspect we've both been in leadership roles, is smart leaders and smart soldiers, is the classic line. I'll be a little heterodox for a Yank and say that smart leaders are more important.
I agree.
Someone has to decide where the Schwerpunkt, where the point of maximum impact, if you're talking about a battle, is going to be. And it doesn't really matter how intelligent the individual privates are. So there are a large number of strategies, like bringing in high IQ foreign workers or training people to the true max of their capabilities, that will keep GDP pretty stable, even if we see, a 2% drop in population IQ. Again, I don't see why we would submit to that, though. It'd be fairly easy to do targeted merit immigration. But as with many things, there seems to be an idea that this is racist for some reason right now.
But so we're wrapping up. But before we go, Wilfred, last point for me, and you don't need to respond, but conspicuous consumption. Black American, did you say that Black Americans spend more on conspicuous consumption than non-Blacks? You don't have to respond, but I'm going to share a challenge. Yoruba land, Blacks in America are predominantly from West Africa. In Yoruba land and other parts of West Africa, conspicuous consumption was important. People followed big men. The productive entrepreneurs really enjoy having a followership of people who respected them and validated their worth. And maybe some of these cultural traits were transplanted to the New World during slavery. Furthermore, enslaved populations, the social dynamics and interrelations were quite complicated. Some slaves were more respected than others. So maybe conspicuous consumption in the Black community is really a legacy of a long-term cultural and evolutionary selection. You don't have to respond, but I think this is an interesting idea.
I don't have any problem responding at all.
Yeah,
I don't have really any off limit
yeah,
topics.
it's conspicuous consumption because if you're from Africa where the big man was important for a longer time, you're going to engage in conspicuous consumption. So maybe
I think
that could be one reason why the why blacks care more about followership and spending and using luxury goods to validate themselves than others. It's a part of a long history.
Yeah, I think so. One thing that's interesting there is that you're talking about something that predates slavery. So
Yes.
there's a tendency, as a political scientist, I find this very annoying actually. There's a tendency in fields like Black studies and the like to look only at America only in the past 200 years. And this completely ignores the fact that, as Tom Sowell or Walter Williams would point out, groups have cultures that date back to different places all around the world. And you can literally trace this if you're listening to, say, poor white dialect in Appalachia to specific regions of England 400 years ago. Of course, the same thing can be true of Blacks. So when you argue, like if someone like Dr. Kendi were to argue, other than racism, what would you say that a gap in performance might be due to? If, leaving the genetics arguments aside, there are a number of arguments. I mean, one would be original culture. So what is the culture like in the region of Africa that Black Americans come from? Another would be encounter culture. What was the, or first encounter culture? What was the culture of armed poor whites in the South like when Black Americans met and fought with and worked for them? Was that a high focus, high literacy culture? A third would be, and I think anyone can answer that, a third would be, what were the forces of almost luck that interacted on these populations? So what, did welfare policy change just as Black Americans were moving to the cities? You know, a fourth would be past racism. And the fifth, which is to me a thin shadow of the others, would be contemporary ethnic conflict. That doesn't predict anything. We all engage in it. Jewish Americans face as much prejudice as Blacks do in many ways, but they're the richest group in the country. So that doesn't explain gaps. The Esri, specifically the conspicuous consumption example, I think quite possibly Black Americans would have come from a region that had a actually fairly wealthy, because of the slave trade, big man culture. They came to the South, they probably encountered a different big man culture. And then you go into the cities, which in every culture have been known for flashy, flamboyant.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that point 1, 2, 3, yes, that it came from somewhere. The only point I would make, and this isn't defending problematic behaviors in the Black community, because I mean, kind of who cares what other groups do, but these things aren't in many cases just Black behaviors. I mean,
Not at all.
yeah, this is actually, the two conversations I've had today were fascinating, because the first one was with a guy named Pete Turner, who was a US soldier in Afghanistan. And almost everything that you've described, like at the level prior to full cultural stability, or whatever you want to call it, everyone does the same thing. Like in Afghanistan, you have essentially the warlords in the country essentially run independent chiefdoms in political science terms. They are lesser governments under the control of the state, which they don't respect very much. And all the things that you're describing from the chiefdoms, they weren't quite states in West Africa, most of them, would be visible there, like the big roast of meat a couple of times a year, you know, the Mercedes for the leader, you know, the armed fighting men that follow the secondary guy around, so on down the line. None of those are particularly or uniquely Black. And I would guess the average tested IQ in Afghanistan is behind white or Black Americans, not to mock them. Those are just human traits. The question with Black America is that a lot of those human traits are at a point now where they're pretty problematic.
Yes.
In modern developed Western society. So with Afghans or poor whites or most other groups, those kind of get kicked out of you when you come here. There's very little tolerance of it. With Blacks, we run the risk of that being described by kind of white would-be allies as authentic Black culture. And that's actually really problematic.
The romanticization of ghetto culture.
Yeah. This is a problem in the Black culture. It's a problem also for whites who get, a lot of white people, and this even dates back to some of my friends in high school, tend to view the ghetto as kind of like Margaret Mead's Samoa. Mm-hmm. Like I can go down there, and if I'm a decent looking Caucasian athlete, I can get laid, I can buy weed, I can play basketball without any rules, you know, I can smoke some blunts, and then I can go back to my suburban house. And the encouragement of, no, and partying is fun, everyone parties, but the
I don't party.
You don't?
No, I'm not a party person.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah, but I like cocktails. I like the cocktail food.
It's a healthy enough trait for a grown-up, but I mean, like, the idea on the part of white quote-unquote allies that Black America is an ongoing party for them, I think is pretty problematic. And this is, you see this constantly. I mean, there's a song, again, excuse the language, but Wet Ass Pussy Wop, that's essentially just, I like the video, but it's just a bunch of Black women kind of grinding on each other half naked. This song was #1 in the country for a matter of months. And a lot of my friends who are mostly white feminists, in terms of people who listen to WAP, said things like, it's so great to see Black performers being honored like this. I don't know if that is the apex of Black American culture, but as long as people think that it is, and as long as there are people out there promoting this as, you know, the authentic way to resist the whites or something like that, a lot of these same problems are going to continue in the Black community. In reality, like, is the IQ 95 or 100? That doesn't really matter in terms of solving these problems. Like the IQ in Southern Italy is 95. They don't have any shortage of fathers. You know, so even the mafia makes you stay with your wife. You know, so we need to encourage, I think, positive, healthy behavior in the Black community by focusing on those things that are positive, healthy behaviors for humans everywhere.
Yeah, and last word, don't be like Nick Cannon and celebrate promiscuity and having children out of wedlock. But bye. All right, it's a pleasure to speak to you.
Fair enough.